Hey everybody, Mr. Hart here. Today we're going to read Chapter 3 of Lord of the Flies. It's called Huts on the Beach. As a little recap, our first two chapters, we had a group of boys who found themselves stranded on an island. When the boys arrived, they voted Ralph to be the leader of them. One of the first things he set everybody off to do was go build a fire. And the idea would be for signaling purposes and just for their own cooking, warmth purposes, all that. In the mix of that, some arguments definitely arose, especially with the one character named Piggy. A lot of the characters seem to be making fun of Piggy so far, and Piggy really, he likes his rules. He's very insistent that everybody passes along the conch as they originally established, which a conch is a shell. And he says, no, you have to make sure that if you're going to talk, you're going to have that. You must have that in your hands. But yes, so Piggy's been getting a lot of disagreements with many of the other boys here, especially during the fire. And at the end of that fire building scene, we find out that a little kid who was brought up at the beginning of the story, he has disappeared. And they don't know where he is or what happened to him, but that's where we last left off here. So with that, we're going to start Chapter 3. Huts on the Beach. Jack was bent double. He was down like a sprinter, his nose only a few inches from the humid earth. The tree trunks and the creepers that festooned them lost themselves in the green dusk 30 feet above him, and all was undergrowth. There was only the faintest indication of a trail there. A cracked twig, at what might be the impression of one side of a hoof. He lowered the chin and stared at the traces as long as he would force them to speak to him. Then, dog-like, uncomfortably on all fours, yet unheeding his discomfort, he stole forward 5 yards and he stopped. Here was a loop of a creeper with a tendril pendant from a node. The tendril was polished on the underside. Pigs, passing through the loop, brushed it with their bristly hide. Jack crouched with his face a few inches away from the clue, then stared forward with the semi-darkness of the undergrowth. His sandy hair, considerably longer than what it would have been when they dropped in, was lighter now, and his bare back was a mass of dark freckles and peeling sunburn. A sharpened stick about 5 feet long trailed from his right hand, and except for a pair of tattered shorts held up by the knife belt, he was naked. He closed his eyes, raised his head, and breathed in gently with the flared nostrils, assessing the current of warm air for information. The forest and he were very still. At length he let out his breath in a long sigh and opened his eyes. They were bright blue eyes that in his frustration seemed bolting and nearly mad. He passed his tongue across dry lips and scanned the uncommunicable forest. Then again he stole forward and cast his way, and that over the ground. The silence of the forest was more oppressive than the heat, and at this hour of the day there was not even the whine of insects. Only when Jack himself roused a gaudy bird from a primitive nest of sticks was the silence shattered, and echoes set ringing by a harsh cry that seemed to come out of the abyss of ages. Jack himself shrank at the cry with a hiss of indrawn breath, and for a minute became less a hunter than a furtive thing, ape-like among the tangle of the trees. And then the frustration claimed him again, and he searched the ground avidly. And by the trunk of a vast tree that grew pale flowers on its gray bark he checked, closed his eyes, and once more drew in the warm air. And this time he breathed, his breath came short. There was even a passing pallor in his face, and then the surge of blood again. He passed like a shadow under the darkness of the tree and crouched, looking down at the trodden ground at his feet. The droppings were warm. They lay piled among the turned earth. They were olive green, smooth, and they steamed a little. Jack lifted his head and stared at the inscrutable masses of the creeper that lay across the trail. And then he raised his spear and he sneaked forward. Beyond the creeper, the trail joined a pig run that was wide enough for the trodden enough to be a path. The ground was hardened by an accustomed tread, and as Jack rose to his full height, he heard something moving on. He swung back his right arm and he hurled the spear with all his strength, and from the pig run came the quick, hard patter of hooves. A castanet sound, reductive, maddening, the promise of meat. He rushed out of the undergrowth and snatched up his spear. The patterning of the pig's trotter died away in the distance. And then Jack just stood there, streaming with sweat, streaked with brown earth, stained by all the vicissitudes of the day's hunting. Swearing, he turned off the trail and he pushed his way through the forest, opened a little, and instead of bald trunks supporting a dark roof, there were a light gray trunks and crowns of feathery palm. Beyond these was the glitter of the sea, and he could hear voices. Ralph was standing by a contraption of palm trees and leaves, a rude shelter that faced the lagoon and seemed very near to falling down. He did not notice when Jack spoke. "Got any water?" Jack looked up, frowning, or Ralph looked up, frowning from the complication of leaves. He did not notice Jack even when he saw him. "I said, have you got any water? I'm thirsty." Ralph withdrew his attention from the shelter and realized Jack with a start. "Oh, hello, water? Oh, it's there by the tree. Ought to be some left there." Jack took up a coconut shell and brimmed with fresh water from a group that was arranged in the shade, and he drank. The water splashed over his chin and neck and chest, and he breathed noisily when he had finished. "Yeah, thanks, needed that." Simon spoke from inside the shelter. "Up a bit." Ralph turned to the shelter and lifted a branch with a whole tiling of leaves. The leaves came apart, fluttered down, and Simon's contrite face appeared in the hole. "I'm sorry?" Ralph surveyed the wreck with distaste. "Never get it done." He flung himself down at Jack's feet, and Simon remained looking out of the hole in the shelter. And once down, Ralph explained, "Been working for days now, and look!" 2 shelters were in position, but they were shaky. He flung himself down at Jack's feet, and Simon remained looking down at the hole in the shelter. Once down, Ralph explained, "Been working for days now." Sorry, guys, I want you to... There we go, that's better. "Been working for days now, and look!" 2 shelters were in position, but shaky. This one was a ruin. "And they keep running off. You remember that meeting? How's everyone going to work hard until the shelter was finished? You remember when everyone said they'd do that?" "Yeah, except me and the hunters." "Except for the hunters. Well, all the little ones are..." He gesticulated and he sought for a word. "Ah, they're hopeless. The older ones aren't much better either, do you see? All day I've been working with Simon, but no one else has helped us. They're off bathing or eating or playing." Simon poked his head out carefully. "Well, you chief, you tell them off." Ralph lay flat and looked up at the palm trees in the sky. "Meetings. Don't we love meetings every day, twice a day? We talk." He got on one elbow. "I bet if I blew the conch this minute, they'd come a-running. And then we'd be, very solemn, and someone would say we ought to build a jet or a submarine or a TV set. But then when that meeting was over, they'd work for maybe 5 minutes, and then they'd wander off or go hunting." Jack flushed. "We want meat." "Well, we haven't got any yet, and we want shelters. And besides, the rest of your hunters came back hours ago. They've all been swimming." "Well, I went on. I let them go. I had to go on. He tried to convey the compulsion to track down and kill that swallowing pig, but it just swelled up and he couldn't say anything. "I went on. I thought by myself maybe I'd have a better shot of getting the pig." The madness came into his eyes again. "I thought I might kill..." "But you didn't kill a pig, did you?" "Well, I thought I might." Some hidden passion vibrated in Ralph's eyes and his voice. "But you haven't yet." His invitation might have passed a casual were it not for this undertone. "You wouldn't care to help with the shelters, I suppose?" "We want meat, don't we?" "Yeah, and we don't get the meat anyway." Now the antagonism was audible. "But I shall get it. Next time, I've got to get to the barb on the spear. We've wounded a pig and the spear fell out. If we could just make some more barbs..." "We need shelter right now." Suddenly, Jack shouted in rage. "Are you accusing me of..." "All I'm saying is that we have worked darsh hard, that's all." They were both red in the face and found looking at each other very difficult. Ralph rolled on his stomach and began to play with the grass. "If it rains like this, when we're dropped in, we'll need shelter, all right. And then another thing. We need shelters because of the..." He paused for a moment, and then they both pushed their anger away. Then he went on to the safe, and he changed the subject. He decided to be safe. "You noticed, haven't you?" Jack put down his spear and squatted. "Noticed what?" Well, everybody seems to be frightened. He rolled over and he peered into Jack's fierce, dirty face. I mean, the way they are. They dream. You can hear them. They've been awake all night. Jack shook his head. They talk and they scream, the little ones. Even some of the others, as if it wasn't a good island. Astonished at the interruption, they all looked up at Simon's serious face. As if the beastly snake thing was real, remember? The two older boys flinched when they heard the shameful syllable. Snakes were not mentioned now. They were not mentionable. Yes, as if this wasn't a good island, said Ralph slowly. Yes, that's right. Jack sat up and he stretched out his legs. Well, they're all batty. Crackers! Remember when we went exploring, how they all panicked? They grinned at each other, remembering the glamour of that first day, and Ralph went on. So we need shelters as a sort of home. Okay, that's right. Jack drew up his legs, clasped his knees, and frowned in an effort to attain clarity. All the same in the forest. I mean, when you're hunting, not when you're getting fruit, of course, but when you're out on your own. He paused for a moment, not sure if Ralph would take him seriously. No, go on. If you're hunting sometimes, you catch yourself feeling as if there's nothing in it, of course, just a feeling, but you can feel as if when you're hunting, but somehow you feel you're not hunting at all, but as if you're being hunted by something. As if something were behind you at every moment out in the jungle. At this they were silent again, and Simon, intent, Ralph incredulous and faintly indignant. He sat up, rubbing one shoulder with a dirty hand. Well, I don't know. Jack leapt to his feet and spoke very quickly. That's how you can feel in the forest. Of course, there's nothing in it. I mean, there's only... He took a few rapid steps towards the beach, and then he came back. Only I know how they feel. See, that's all. That's all I'm trying to say. I know how they feel. The best thing we can do is get ourselves rescued. Jack had to think for a moment before he could remember what rescue even was. Rescue? Yes, of course. All the same, I'd like to catch a pig first. He snatched up his spear, and he dashed into the ground. The opaque, mad look suddenly came into his eyes, and Ralph looked at him critically through his tangle of fair hair. So long as your hunters remember the fire. You and your fire. The two boys trotted down the beach and turned the water's edge, looked back at the pink mountain. The trickle of smoke sketched a chalky line up the solid blue of the sky and wavered high up and faded, and Ralph frowned. I wonder how far you can see that. Miles. We don't make enough smoke. The bottom part of the trickle, as though conscious of their gaze, thickened to a creamy blur which crept up the feeble column. They're put on green branches, I wonder. He screwed up his eyes and swung around to search the horizon. Got it! Jack shouted so loudly that Ralph jumped. What? Where? Is it a ship or something? But Jack was pointing to the high declivities that led down the mountain of the flatter part of the island. Of course! They'll lie up there. They must. When the sun's too hot, that's where the pigs will go. Ralph gazed bewildered at his rapt face. They get up high up in the shade, resting during the heat, like cows at home. Oh, man, I thought you saw a ship or something. We could steal up on one. We will paint our faces so they won't be able to see us. Perhaps we'll surround them, and then... Indignation now took away Ralph's control. I was talking about smoke. Don't you want to be rescued? And all you can think about is a pig, pig, pig. That's it, a pig. But we want to have meat, don't we? And I work all day with nothing but Simon, and then you come back and you don't even notice all the huts that we've made for you. Well, I was working too. But you like it. You want to hunt. Well, They faced each other on the bright beach, astonished at the rub of the feeling. Ralph looked away first, pretending interest in a group of Litluns was in the sand, and from beyond the platform came the shouting of the hunters in the swimming pool, and on the other end of the platform, Piggy was lying flat, looking down at the brilliant water. Well, people don't help much here. He wanted to explain how people were never quiet, or never quite what you want them to be. Well, what about Simon? He helps. He pointed at the shelters. Well, all the rest of them all rush off. He's done as much as I have, only Simon's always about. Ralph started back to the shelters, but Jack by his side. Do a bit for you, before I have a bathe. Oh, no, no. Don't bother at this point. But when they reached the shelter, Simon was not to be seen. Ralph put his head in the hole, withdrew it, and he turned to Jack. I guess he buzzed off. Yeah, I guess he got fed up and gone for a bath. Ralph frowned. He's queer. He's funny. Jack nodded as much as he could for the sake of agreeing if anything, and by a tacit consent they left the shelter and went towards the bathing pool. And then, when I have a bath and something to eat, I'll just trek over to the other side of the mountain and see if I can get any traces. You coming? But the sun's nearly set. Well, I might still have some time. They walked along 2 continents of experience and feeling, unable to communicate. If I could only get a pig! I'll come back and go on with the shelter. They looked at each other, baffled in the love, and both love and hate at the same time. All the warm salt water of the bathing pool and the shouting and splashing and laughing were just sufficient to bring them together again. Simon was not in the bathing pool as they had expected, and when the others 2 had trotted down the beach to look back at the mountains, he had followed them for a few yards and then stopped. He had just stood frowning down at the pile of sand on the beach where somebody had been trying to build a house or hunt. Then he turned his back and walked into the forest with an air of purpose. He was a small, skinny boy, his chin pointed, and his eyes were too bright that they had deceived Ralph into thinking him delightfully gay and wicked. His coarse mop of black hair was long and swung down, almost concealing a low, broad forehead. He wore the remains of shorts, and his feet were bare like Jack's. Always darkish in color, Simon was burned by the sun to a deep tan that glistened with sweat. He picked his way up the scar, past the great rock where Ralph was climbed on the first morning, and then he turned off his right among the trees. He walked with an accustomed tread among the acres of the fruit trees, where the least energetic could find an easy if unsatisfying meal. Flower and fruit grew together on the same tree, and everything had the scent of ripeness and the booming of a million bees of pasture. Here the little ones, who had run after him, caught up with him. They talked, cried out unintelligibly, and lugged him towards the trees. And then amid the roar of the bees and the afternoon sunlight, Simon found for them the fruit that they could not reach. He pulled off the choicest one from up on the foliage, and he passed them back to the endless outstretched hands. When he had satisfied them, he paused and he looked around. The little ones watched him inscrutably in double handfuls of ripe fruit. Simon turned away from them and went where the just was perceptible path led him. Soon the high jungle closed in. Tall trunks bore unexpected pale flowers all the way up to the dark canopy where life went on clamorously. The air there was dark too, and the creepers dropped their robes like rigging of a founding ship. He felt left prints on the soft soil, and the creepers shivered throughout their lengths when he bumped them. He came at last to a place where the most sunshine fell, and since they were not so far to go light, the creepers had woven a great mat and hung on the side of an open space in the jungle. For here a patch of rock came close to the surface and would not allow more than little plants and ferns to grow. The whole space was walled with dark aromatic bushes and a bowl of heat and light, and a great tree fallen across one corner leaned against the trees that still stood, and a rapid climber flaunted red and yellow sprays right up to the top. And at this Simon paused. He looked over his shoulder as Jack had done in the same way behind him, and he glanced swiftly around to confirm that he was still utterly alone. And for a moment, his movements were almost furtive. And then he bent down and he wormed his way into the center of the mat. The creepers and the bushes were so close that he left the sweat on them, and they pulled together behind him. And when he was secure in the middle, he was in a little cabin screened off from the open space by a few leaves. He squatted down, parted the leaves, and looked out into the clearing. Nothing moved but a pair of gaudy butterflies that danced around each other in the hot air. Holding his breath, he cocked a critical ear on the sounds of the island. Evening was advancing towards the island, and the sounds of the bright, fantastic birds, those bee sounds, even the crying of the gulls that were returning to the roost among the square rocks, were fainter. The deep sea, breaking miles away on the reef, made an undertone less perceptible than the susurration of the blood. Simon dropped the screen of leaves into place. The slope of the bars of honey-colored sunlight decreased. They slid up the bushes, passed over the green candle like buds, moved up towards the canopy in darkness, and thickened under the trees. And with the fading of the light, the riotous colors died, and the heat and urgency cooled away. The candle buds stirred. Their green sepals drew back a little, and the white tips of the flowers rose delicately to meet the open air. And now the sunlight had lifted clear of the open space and withdrawn from the sky. Darkness poured out, submerging the waves between the trees till they were dim and strange as the bottom of the sea. The candle buds opened, their wide white flowers glimmering under the light, and pricked down from the first stars. Their scent spilled into the air and took possession of the island. All right, guys. So that is the end of chapter, chapter 3. I want you guys to think a couple things I do want to bring to our attention here. The boys are definitely arguing. I don't know. I want you to think, can you learn anything from their arguments so far? At the end here, when Simon is out in the middle of the woods, what do we think exactly was happening here? Do you think that these are true noises? Do you think do you think there's a monster? This reminds me personally, I don't know if you guys have seen the TV show Lost. I'm guessing not. It came out about 16 years ago. But it was a show about a bunch of characters who were deserted on an island just like this. And in that show, they instantly, when they started getting there, started to hear noises out in the woods. And they started to think that they weren't alone. Definitely a good watch, guys. I believe it's on Netflix. Something to potentially watch that would definitely very much so go along with what we're currently reading about. So with that, guys, look to discussion questions. I'm going to try to post this and the next chapter back to back. I saw a lot of us watch chapter 1, not so many for chapter 2. Which that's fine. I know some of us maybe just prefer to read it independently. But just in case you were just waiting and you want to keep going, I'm going to try to post these back to back to back tonight. So take care, everybody. Have a good one.